It started like any other day, just an ordinary Tuesday with nothing remarkable to set it apart. I was sipping my morning coffee, enjoying the brief moment of calm before the day's chaos set in. Charlie, my loyal and ever enthusiastic Labrador, was at my feet, his soft brown eyes gazing up at me, silently begging for a treat or perhaps just some attention. Charlie had been with me for 7 years, ever since he was a pudgy little puppy with paws too big for his body. He was a constant in my life, my shadow, my confidant. We had our routines, our shared moments of quiet understanding, and I couldn't imagine my life without him. That morning, after I finished my coffee, I grabbed his leash and called him to the door. We always went for a walk before I headed to work, a daily ritual that we both looked forward to. But that day, something felt off. Charlie seemed unusually restless, pacing around the living room with a nervous energy I hadn't seen in him before. "Come on, buddy," I said, trying to coax him to the door. He hesitated for a moment before finally trotting over, his tail wagging half-heartedly. We took our usual route, a winding path through the quiet suburban neighborhood where I lived. The streets were empty at that hour, save for the occasional car passing by. Charlie sniffed at the ground, his nose working overtime as if trying to pick up a scent. He tugged at the leash, pulling me toward the small wooded area at the end of our route, something he didn't usually do. "Easy, boy," I said, tightening my grip on the leash. But he was insistent, his nose practically glued to the ground as he led me into the woods. The trees closed in around us as we ventured deeper into the forest. I had always found this part of the walk peaceful, a welcome break from the monotony of suburbia. But that day there was a strange stillness in the air, a heavy silence that made the hairs on the back of my neck stand up. Charlie was pulling harder now, his usual enthusiasm replaced by something more urgent, more frantic. I tried to rein him in, but he broke free, tearing off into the underbrush with a speed that left me standing there, dumbfounded. "Charlie," I called out, my voice echoing through the trees. But there was no response, just the rustling of leaves as he disappeared into the woods. I ran after him, my heart pounding in my chest. I called his name over and over, but the only sound was the crunch of leaves beneath my feet and the occasional snap of a twig. The forest seemed to close in around me, the trees growing denser, the shadows darker. I don't know how long I searched for him, minutes, hours. It all blurred together in a haze of panic and desperation. But no matter how hard I looked, how loudly I called his name, Charlie was gone. My name is Jamie, and I've always been the kind of person who found comfort in routine, in the predictability of life's little patterns. I grew up in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knows everyone else's business, and nothing ever really changes. My childhood was uneventful, marked by the usual milestones, school, friends, the occasional teenage rebellion. I was the only child of parents who had me later in life, their unexpected blessing after years of trying. They were loving, supportive, and a little overprotective, but I never felt smothered. They encouraged my curiosity, my love for reading and learning, and always made sure I knew I could do anything I set my mind to. After high school, I went to college in the city, a big, bustling place that was a world away from the quiet life I had known. I studied journalism, driven by a need to uncover the truth, to tell stories that mattered. It was during those years that I met Jason, the man I would later marry. He was everything I wasn't, confident, outgoing, a little reckless. We balanced each other out, and for a while it seemed like we had the perfect life. But life has a way of throwing curveballs when you least expect it. A few years into our marriage, we started drifting apart. The pressures of work, the stress of trying to start a family, the differences that once seemed so complementary began to pull us in opposite directions. We tried to make it work, but in the end, we decided to part ways. The divorce was amicable, but it left me feeling adrift, like I had lost my sense of direction. I moved back to my hometown, taking a job at the local newspaper. It wasn't the exciting career I had envisioned, but it was steady, and it gave me a chance to regroup, to figure out what I wanted from life. It was during that time that I got Charlie. I had always wanted a dog, but with Jason's long hours and our cramped city apartment, it had never seemed practical. But now, living alone in a small house with a big yard, it felt like the right time. Charlie came into my life like a whirlwind, a bundle of energy and unconditional love that filled the void I hadn't even realized was there. He was more than just a pet. He was my companion, my comfort, my reason to get up in the morning. We quickly fell into a routine, our days marked by long walks, lazy afternoons, and evenings curled up on the couch. In many ways, Charlie became my anchor, the one constant in a life that had otherwise been turned upside down. He was there through the loneliness, the uncertainty, the days when it felt like I was just going through the motions. He was the one who kept me grounded, who reminded me that there was still joy to be found, even in the midst of all the chaos. So when Charlie went missing, it was like losing a part of myself. The panic I felt in those first moments, the desperation as I searched the woods, calling his name over and over, was unlike anything I had ever experienced. Charlie wasn't just a dog, he was my family, and the thought of losing him was unbearable. The days that followed were a blur of frantic activity. I spent every spare moment searching for Charlie, scouring the woods, posting flyers, knocking on doors. I called every animal shelter, every vet, every rescue organization within a 100-mile radius, but there was no sign of him. I couldn't eat, couldn't sleep. Every time the phone rang, my heart would leap into my throat, only to sink again when it was just another well-meaning neighbor offering sympathy or a lead that went nowhere. The house felt empty without him, the silence a constant reminder of his absence. At night I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the quiet. The bed felt too big, too cold, without the familiar weight of Charlie curled up at my feet. I would replay that morning over and over in my mind, trying to figure out what had gone wrong, why he had bolted into the woods, what I could have done differently. Guilt gnawed at me, a relentless, insidious presence that whispered in my ear, telling me that I had failed him, that I should have done more, that I should have been faster, smarter, more vigilant. I felt like I had let him down, and the weight of that guilt was crushing. Friends and family tried to comfort me, telling me that it wasn't my fault, that dogs sometimes wander off, that he would come back. But their words felt hollow, like empty platitudes that did nothing to ease the ache in my chest. Charlie wasn't just any dog, he was my dog, and I knew him better than anyone. He wouldn't have just run off without a reason, and the thought that something terrible might have happened to him was more than I could bear. Days turned into weeks, and still, there was no sign of Charlie. The search began to feel hopeless, like I was grasping at straws, chasing shadows, but I couldn't bring myself to give up, to accept that he was gone. I kept searching, kept hoping, kept praying that somehow, some way he would come back to me. I would walk the woods every day, retracing my steps, calling his name until my voice was hoarse. I would sit on the porch at night, staring out into the darkness, listening for the sound of his paws on the gravel, the jingle of his collar, the bark that would tell me he was home. But the woods were silent, the nights empty, and Charlie was nowhere to be found. It was a rainy Thursday, about a month after Charlie had disappeared. I had just returned from another fruitless search, soaked to the bone, my spirits at an all-time low. I was on the verge of giving up, of accepting the unbearable reality that Charlie might never come back. I was standing in the kitchen, staring blankly at the window, When I heard it, a faint scratching at the back door. My heart skipped a beat, and for a moment I thought I had imagined it. But then it came again, more insistent this time. I rushed to the door, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the lock. When I finally managed to open it, there he was, wet and bedraggled, but very much alive. "Charlie," I cried, dropping to my knees to embrace him. He was thinner than I remembered, his fur matted and dirty, but he was home. I held him close, tears streaming down my face, unable to believe that he was really there. Charlie licked my face, his tail wagging weakly, as if he was just as relieved to see me as I was to see him. I couldn't stop crying, couldn't stop hugging him, whispering his name over and over. For a moment, everything was perfect. The nightmare was over, and Charlie was back where he belonged. But as the initial rush of relief began to fade, I noticed that something was off. Charlie was different. At first, I chalked it up to the ordeal he had been through. He had been missing for weeks, and who knew what he had gone through in that time? It was only natural that he would be a little different, a little more subdued. But as the days went by, the changes became more pronounced. Charlie was no longer the playful, affectionate dog I had known. He seemed distant, almost aloof, as if he was lost in his own world. He would spend hours staring off into space, his eyes unfocused, his ears twitching as if he was listening to something I couldn't hear. He was also jumpy, easily startled by the smallest noise or movement. The sound of the doorbell, the rustling of leaves, even the hum of the refrigerator would send him into a fit of barking, his hackles raised, his body tense. But the most unsettling change was the way he looked at me. There was something different in his eyes, something I couldn't quite put my finger on. It was as if he was looking at me but not really seeing me, as if he was seeing something else, something I couldn't see. At night he would pace around the house, his nails clicking on the hardwood floors. I would lie in bed listening to the sound, a knot of unease growing in my stomach. Sometimes I would wake up to find him standing at the foot of the bed, staring at me with those strange, distant eyes. I tried to ignore it, to tell myself that it was just my imagination, that he was still the same Charlie deep down. But the feeling of unease only grew, until it was all I could think about. Something was wrong with Charlie. I didn't know what it was, but I could feel it, like a dark cloud hanging over us, growing thicker and more oppressive with each passing day. I took him to the vet, hoping for some kind of explanation, but the vet couldn't find anything physically wrong with him. He was healthy, at least as healthy as a dog who had been missing for weeks could be. But when I tried to explain the changes in his behavior, the vet just shrugged it off, saying that it was probably just a result of whatever he had been through while he was missing. But I knew it was more than that. I could feel it in my bones, in the pit of my stomach. This wasn't just a case of a dog being traumatized by a bad experience. There was something fundamentally different about Charlie, something that went beyond the physical. As the days turned into weeks, the sense of dread that had been gnawing at the edges of my mind began to take over. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was horribly, irrevocably wrong, not just with Charlie, but with the house, with everything. The changes in Charlie's behavior became more pronounced, more disturbing. He started growling at nothing, his eyes fixed on empty corners of the room, his body tense as if ready to pounce. He would bark at shadows, his fur bristling, his growls low and menacing. But it wasn't just his behavior that was unsettling. There were other things too, things that I couldn't explain, things that made me question my own sanity. I would hear noises at night, scratching sounds coming from the walls, footsteps in the hallway, the sound of something moving through the house. But whenever I would get up to investigate, there was nothing there. Lights would flicker on and off. The temperature in the house would drop suddenly. And there were times when I would catch a glimpse of something out of the corner of my eye, something dark, something that would disappear the moment I turned to look at it. I began to feel like I was being watched, like there was something in the house with us, something malevolent, something that didn't belong. I tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination, that I was just being paranoid, but the feeling of unease wouldn't go away. It was like a dark cloud hanging over me, growing thicker and more oppressive with each passing day. And then there were the dreams. They started out innocently enough, just vague, unsettling images that would disappear the moment I woke up. But as time went on, they became more vivid, more terrifying. I would dream of Charlie, but it wasn't really him. It was something else, something wearing his skin, something with dark, hollow eyes and a twisted, malevolent grin. It would stare at me, its eyes boring into mine, and I would wake up drenched in sweat, my heart pounding in my chest. The dreams became more frequent, more intense, until they were happening every night. I would wake up in a cold sweat, my heart racing, the image of those dark, hollow eyes burned into my mind. I tried to push the fear aside, to tell myself that it was just a bad dream, that it didn't mean anything. But the fear wouldn't go away. It clung to me, a constant, suffocating presence that made it impossible to think, to breathe. I began to dread going to bed, to dread the night and the darkness that came with it. I would lie in bed, staring at the ceiling, listening to the sounds of the house, waiting for the next creak, the next shadow, the next terrifying vision. I was losing my grip on reality, and I didn't know how much longer I could hold on. It was a stormy night, about 2 months after Charlie had returned. The wind was howling outside, the rain lashing against the windows. The power had gone out, plunging the house into darkness. I was sitting in the living room, a flashlight in my hand, trying to calm my nerves. Charlie was lying on the floor, his eyes fixed on the darkness beyond the window. He hadn't moved for hours, hadn't made a sound, but there was something about the way he was staring into the darkness that sent a shiver down my spine. I couldn't shake the feeling that something was watching us, something out there in the storm. The darkness felt alive, like it was pressing in on us, suffocating us. And then I heard it, a low, guttural growl, coming from the direction of the window. My heart stopped, and for a moment I couldn't breathe. I turned the flashlight toward the window, the beam cutting through the darkness. But there was nothing there. Charlie was still lying on the floor, but now he was growling, his body tense, his eyes locked on the window. His growl was low and menacing, a sound I had never heard from him before. I pointed the flashlight at him, the beam illuminating his face. And that's when I saw it. His eyes, they weren't the warm, brown eyes I had known for years. They were dark, almost black, with a malevolent glint that made the hair stand up on my neck. I stumbled back, my breath catching in my throat. This wasn't Charlie, this was something else, something that had taken his place. Charlie, I whispered, my voice trembling. But the thing that was Charlie just growled, its eyes narrowing, its lips curling back in a snarl. I backed away, my heart pounding in my chest. I didn't know what to do, didn't know how to get away from this thing that had taken my dog. And then, with a sudden burst of speed, it lunged at me, its teeth bared, its eyes filled with malice. I screamed, throwing the flashlight at it, the beam spinning wildly as it hit the floor. I stumbled backward, my hands fumbling for something, anything, to defend myself. But it was too late. The last thing I saw before everything went black was those dark, hollow eyes, filled with a malevolent hunger. I woke up in the hospital, my body aching, my mind a foggy mess. I had no memory of how I had gotten there, no memory of what had happened after the thing that had once been Charlie had attacked me. The doctors told me that a neighbor had found me unconscious on my front porch, covered in scratches and bruises. They said that I had been lucky, that if I had been found any later, I might not have made it. But I didn't feel lucky. I felt hollow, like a part of me had been ripped away, leaving behind a gaping, empty void. The house was gone, burned to the ground in the storm. The fire department said it was an accident, that the storm had caused a power surge that had started the fire, but I knew better. The thing that had taken Charlie was gone, but so was Charlie, and I knew that I would never see him again. I don't know what that thing was, what it wanted, or where it came from, but I do know that it was evil, that it had taken my dog and left me with nothing but fear and pain. It was a small, quiet neighborhood, the kind that could have been plucked straight out of a storybook. Tree-lined streets, well-kept lawns, and the soft hum of life gently moving forward were the defining characteristics of the place I had called home for the last 5 years. The kind of neighborhood where everyone knew each other's names, and the biggest drama was when Mrs. Gallagher's cat got stuck in a tree. I had moved here seeking that peace, that quiet after the chaos of the city, and I had found it. My house was a modest, 2-story home with a neat white picket fence and a small garden out front. It wasn't much, but it was mine, and it was everything I had wanted. After the noise and the bustle of the city, this little corner of the world felt like a sanctuary. But the house wasn't just mine. It was home to Toby as well, my loyal, adventurous cat who had been my companion for nearly a decade. Toby was a sleek, black cat with a patch of white on his chest that looked like a little bow tie. He had the kind of personality that could fill a room. He was independent but affectionate, mischievous but loving. He had a knack for getting into trouble, but he always found his way back home, often with a look of pure satisfaction on his face, as if to say, "You wouldn't believe what I got up to today." The neighborhood was perfect for him. There were plenty of places for him to explore, yards, trees, and the occasional shed that offered a treasure trove of smells and sights. The neighbors all knew him by name, and more than a few had a soft spot for him. It wasn't uncommon for me to get a call from Mrs. Gallagher, who lived 3 houses down, telling me that Toby was in her kitchen again, begging for a treat. Life was good. I had a job that I loved, a home that I was proud of, and Toby by my side. It felt like everything was exactly as it should be, and for a while it was. My name is Jared, and if you had asked me 5 years ago where I saw myself, the answer wouldn't have been here. I grew up in a big city, the kind of place where the noise never stopped, where the lights never went out, and where the pace of life was relentless. I had always been drawn to that energy, that constant movement, and for a long time it suited me. I worked as a graphic designer, and I was good at it, so good in fact that by the time I was 30 I had climbed the corporate ladder higher than I had ever expected. My life was fast-paced, exciting, and at times overwhelming. But I thrived on it, or at least I thought I did. Toby came into my life during that time, a little ball of fluff with big green eyes that I found abandoned in an alley on a cold winter night. He was tiny, barely old enough to be away from his mother, and I knew the moment I saw him that he wasn't going to survive out there alone. So I took him home, fed him, and gave him a warm place to sleep. I hadn't planned on keeping him. I didn't have the time or the energy for a pet, but Toby had other ideas. He wormed his way into my heart, as cats often do, and before I knew it, I couldn't imagine life without him. But the city, with all its noise and chaos, began to wear on me. The constant rush, the long hours, the feeling that I was always on the edge of burning out, it all started to take its toll. I found myself longing for something different, something quieter, something that would allow me to breathe. That's when I found the house in the small neighborhood, miles away from the city I had called home for so long. It was the opposite of everything I had known, but it was exactly what I needed. So I took the plunge. I left the city, my high-powered job, and everything that came with it, and I started over. The transition wasn't easy. I went from a life of constant stimulation to one where the loudest noise was the wind rustling through the trees. But slowly I began to adjust. I started freelancing, picking up projects that allowed me to work from home, and I found that the peace and quiet were exactly what I had been craving. And through it all, there was Toby, my constant companion, the one thing that hadn't changed. He seemed to love the new place as much as I did, and watching him explore his new surroundings helped me to settle in. We had our routines, morning coffee on the porch while Toby chased leaves in the yard, afternoons working at my desk with Toby curled up in the sunspot by the window, and evenings spent curled up on the couch, Toby purring softly beside me. It wasn't the life I had imagined, but it was a good life, a quiet life, a life that felt like it was finally mine. The first time I saw the stranger, I didn't think much of it. It was early evening, just after sunset, and I was out in the yard watering the plants. Toby was with me, prowling around the garden, chasing after some imaginary prey. I was lost in thought, enjoying the cool evening air, when I noticed someone standing at the edge of my yard. He was a tall man, dressed in dark clothes that seemed almost too formal for the neighborhood, a long black coat that hung just below his knees, a wide-brimmed hat that cast a shadow over his face. He stood perfectly still, his hands in his pockets, watching Toby with an intensity that immediately put me on edge. "Can I help you?" I called out, my voice louder than I intended, trying to sound more confident than I felt. The man didn't respond at first. He just stood there, his eyes locked on Toby as the cat chased after a moth. It wasn't until I called out again that he finally looked at me. Even from a distance, I could see his eyes, dark, piercing, cold. But there was something about the way he looked at me that sent a shiver down my spine, a look that felt more like an intrusion than a glance. "I'm sorry," he said finally, his voice low and smooth. "I didn't mean to intrude. I was just admiring your cat." The words were innocent enough, but there was something in the way he said them that made my skin crawl. There was a slight accent, something European, but I couldn't place it. I forced a smile, though it felt strained. "Toby is a bit of a troublemaker," I said, trying to keep the tone light. "He loves to explore." The man nodded, but his eyes never left Toby. "He's a fine animal, very spirited." There was a pause, an awkward silence that seemed to stretch on for far too long. I didn't know what else to say, and the man seemed in no hurry to leave. Finally, I cleared my throat, taking a step closer to the house. "Well, if you'll excuse me, I need to get back inside. Have a good evening." He tipped his hat slightly, a gesture that felt oddly formal, almost old-fashioned. "Good evening," he said, and without another word he turned and walked away, disappearing down the street. I stood there for a moment, watching him go, a feeling of unease settling in the pit of my stomach. There was something about the encounter that didn't sit right with me, something about the way he had looked at Toby that felt wrong. But I tried to shake it off, telling myself that I was just being paranoid, that there was nothing to worry about. Toby didn't seem bothered. He continued to chase after the moth, oblivious to the stranger's presence. I called him inside, and he trotted over to me, rubbing against my legs as if sensing my unease. I gave him a scratch behind the ears, trying to reassure myself as much as him. But the feeling of unease lingered long after the man had gone, a shadow that followed me into the house and refused to leave. Over the next few days, I couldn't shake the memory of the stranger. His face, his voice, the way he had looked at Toby, it all played over and over in my mind, like a record stuck on a loop. I tried to dismiss it, to tell myself that it was nothing, that he was just a passerby who had taken a moment to admire my cat. But the feeling of unease refused to go away. I found myself becoming more protective of Toby, more anxious whenever he was out of my sight. I started keeping him inside more, especially at night, even though he protested. Toby was used to having the run of the neighborhood, and he didn't take kindly to being cooped up in the house. He would sit by the door, meowing plaintively, his green eyes staring up at me with a mixture of confusion and frustration. But I couldn't shake the feeling that something was wrong, that the man's interest in Toby had been more than just idle curiosity. I started to notice other things too, small things, things that I might not have paid attention to before, but that now seemed to take on a sinister significance. There were times when I would catch a glimpse of someone out of the corner of my eye, standing just at the edge of my yard, watching the house. But whenever I turned to look, there was no one there. I would hear footsteps outside at night, the sound of someone moving through the yard, but when I looked out the window, the yard was empty. I told myself that it was just my imagination, that I was being paranoid, but the feeling of being watched, of being followed, grew stronger with each passing day. I started to feel like I couldn't relax, like I couldn't let my guard down for even a moment. And then there was Toby. He seemed to sense my anxiety, picking up on the tension that had settled over the house like a dark cloud. He became more clingy, more affectionate, as if he knew that something was wrong but didn't know how to fix it. He would follow me from room to room, curling up beside me whenever I sat down, his purring a constant, soothing presence that helped to keep the fear at bay. But even his presence couldn't completely banish the unease that had taken root in my mind. The memory of the stranger, his dark eyes, and the way he had looked at Toby haunted me, a constant reminder that something wasn't right. I started locking the doors and windows every night, something I had never bothered to do before. I bought new locks, installed motion sensor lights around the perimeter of the house, and even considered getting a security system. It felt like overkill, like I was overreacting, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed to do something, anything, to protect Toby. The neighborhood, once a place of peace and tranquility, now felt like a trap. The streets that had once felt so safe now seemed full of hidden dangers, of eyes that watched from the shadows. I found myself avoiding going out after dark, keeping the curtains drawn, and jumping at every little sound. I wanted to talk to someone about it, to share my fears, but I was afraid of sounding ridiculous. The neighbors would think I was crazy, that I was overreacting. After all, what did I have to go on? A brief encounter with a stranger and a vague feeling of unease. It wasn't enough to warrant the kind of fear that had taken hold of me, the kind of fear that kept me awake at night, staring into the darkness, waiting for something to happen. But the fear was there, a constant, gnawing presence that I couldn't ignore, and it was growing stronger with each passing day. It happened on a Sunday, a day that had started out like any other. The sun was shining, the air was warm, and the neighborhood was quiet. I had spent the morning working on a project for a client, my focus entirely on the task at hand. Toby had been in the room with me, napping in his favorite spot by the window, the sunlight casting a warm glow on his sleek black fur. In the afternoon, I decided to take a break and let Toby outside for a bit. He had been restless all morning, and I could tell he wanted to stretch his legs and explore the yard. I opened the door and he bolted out, his tail held high, ready for another adventure. I watched him for a moment, a smile on my face as he darted after a butterfly, his eyes bright with excitement. It was a sight I had seen 100 times before, a sight that always filled me with a sense of contentment. But today there was an edge to that contentment, a sharp undercurrent of fear that I couldn't shake. I told myself that I was being silly, that there was nothing to worry about. But as I stood there, watching Toby chase after the butterfly, I couldn't ignore the feeling that something was wrong, that something was about to happen. I stayed close to the door, keeping an eye on Toby as he prowled around the yard. The minutes ticked by, and nothing happened. The neighborhood was quiet. The only sounds were the rustling of leaves and the distant hum of traffic. I was just starting to relax when I saw him, the stranger from before, standing at the edge of the yard, watching Toby with those dark, piercing eyes. My heart stopped, a cold wave of fear washing over me. He was standing in the same spot where I had seen him before, his posture the same, his hands in his pockets, his eyes locked on Toby. For a moment I couldn't move, couldn't breathe. It was as if time had slowed to a crawl, the world around me fading into the background, leaving only the stranger and Toby in sharp focus. And then, before I could react, the stranger moved. He took a step forward, his eyes still on Toby, and that was all it took. Toby, oblivious to the danger, darted off toward him, his curiosity getting the better of him. "Toby," I shouted, my voice breaking the silence. But it was too late. Toby had already reached the stranger, his nose twitching as he sniffed the man's shoes, his tail flicking back and forth. The stranger knelt down, reaching out a hand to pet Toby, and that was when I snapped out of my paralysis. I bolted out of the house, my heart pounding, my mind racing with fear and anger. "Get away from him," I shouted, my voice shaking as I ran toward them. The stranger looked up at me, his expression calm, almost amused. He didn't move, didn't speak, just watched me with those cold, dark eyes as I ran toward him. But before I could reach them, Toby suddenly bolted away from the stranger, darting across the yard and out of sight. I skidded to a stop, my eyes following Toby's path, my heart hammering in my chest. "Toby," I called out, panic rising in my voice as I searched for him. But he was gone, disappeared into the bushes at the edge of the yard. I turned back to the stranger, anger flaring up inside me. "What did you do?" I demanded, my voice trembling with fear and fury. But the stranger just smiled, a slow, eerie smile that sent a chill down my spine. Nothing he said, his voice smooth and calm. "He's just being a cat." I wanted to scream at him, to demand answers, but before I could say anything else, he turned and walked away, disappearing down the street without another word. I stood there, my heart racing, my mind spinning with fear and confusion. Toby was gone, vanished without a trace, and the stranger had just walked away as if nothing had happened. I called for Toby, my voice shaking, my hands trembling as I searched the yard. But there was no sign of him, no trace of where he had gone. It was as if he had simply disappeared. The fear that had been gnawing at me for days suddenly exploded into full-blown panic. I ran through the neighborhood, calling for Toby, my voice breaking as I begged him to come back. I searched every yard, every bush, every tree, but there was no sign of him. The neighbors came out, drawn by my frantic calls, but no one had seen him. No one knew where he had gone. As the sun began to set, the reality of what had happened began to sink in. Toby was gone, and I had no idea where he was or how to find him. The fear, the anxiety, the protective instincts that had been simmering inside me for days suddenly boiled over, turning into a cold, paralyzing dread. The stranger had taken Toby. I didn't know how or why, but I knew it in my bones. And I knew, deep down, that I would never see him again. It was an ordinary Tuesday evening when my life took a turn for the bizarre. I had just returned home from work, exhausted from another grueling day at the office. My apartment was quiet, save for the faint hum of the refrigerator in the kitchen. The living room was dimly lit, casting long shadows across the worn hardwood floor. It was the kind of place that might seem cozy to some, but lately it had begun to feel unsettling. My cat, Luna, was nowhere to be seen. Usually by this time she would have been waiting for me by the door, her sleek black fur blending into the shadows, her bright green eyes catching the light as she greeted me with a soft purr. But tonight she wasn't there. Luna had been with me for 5 years. I adopted her from a shelter when she was just a kitten, a small, frightened ball of fur with wide eyes that seemed to take in the world with a mixture of curiosity and fear. It took time for her to warm up to me, but once she did, she became my constant companion. She was a typical cat, independent, aloof at times, but always there when I needed her. Her presence was comforting, a reminder that I wasn't truly alone in this world. But lately, something had changed. Luna had started acting strangely, her behavior shifting in ways that I couldn't explain. It began with little things, her reluctance to eat, her tendency to stare at the walls as if she saw something I couldn't, and her growing unease in the apartment. I tried to ignore it at first, brushing it off as just another one of her quirks. But as the days went on, her behavior grew more erratic, more concerning. My name is Emily, and I suppose you could say that my life has always been a bit mundane. I grew up in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone, and nothing much ever happened. My parents were hardworking, decent people who raised me to be the same. I was an only child, which meant that I spent a lot of time alone, reading books, drawing, and dreaming of a life that was different from the one I knew. After high school, I moved to the city for college, eager to escape the small-town life that had begun to feel suffocating. I studied marketing, a practical choice that promised a stable career, but my true passion was always art. I spent hours in my tiny dorm room sketching and painting, losing myself in the colors and shapes that flowed from my imagination. But life has a way of pulling you away from your dreams, and after graduation, I found myself working a 9-to-5 job in an advertising firm. It wasn't what I had envisioned for myself, but it paid the bills, and it allowed me to live in the city, far away from the quiet, predictable life I had left behind. Luna came into my life during a particularly difficult time. I had just gone through a breakup, one that left me feeling more alone than I had ever felt before. The apartment, once a place of refuge, became a prison of loneliness and memories I wanted to forget. A friend suggested getting a pet, and though I was hesitant at first, I found myself at the local shelter one rainy afternoon, staring into the cage of a small black kitten with wide, fearful eyes. There was something about her that drew me in, something in the way she looked at me as if she understood the pain I was feeling. I took her home that day, and though it took time for us to bond, Luna eventually became my closest companion. She was more than just a pet. She was a lifeline, a source of comfort and love in a world that often felt cold and indifferent. We developed a routine, one that brought a sense of order and stability to my life. I would wake up early, feed Luna, and then spend a few minutes playing with her before getting ready for work. In the evenings, she would curl up next to me on the couch as I watched TV or read a book, her purring a soothing sound that helped to ease the stresses of the day. But that routine, that sense of normalcy, began to unravel as Luna's behavior changed. It started with small things, her reluctance to eat, her tendency to avoid certain areas of the apartment, her sudden bouts of nervousness. I tried to tell myself that it was nothing, that she was just being a typical cat, but deep down I knew something was wrong. Luna's behavior grew more unsettling with each passing day. It wasn't just the fact that she was eating less, or that she seemed more anxious than usual. It was the way she started reacting to things that weren't there. I first noticed it one night when we were sitting on the couch. I was engrossed in a book, the TV playing softly in the background, when Luna suddenly sat up, her ears perked, her eyes wide. She was staring at the corner of the room, her body tense, as if she was ready to pounce. I followed her gaze, but there was nothing there, just an empty corner, shrouded in shadow. But Luna was fixated on it, her eyes never leaving that spot. She let out a low growl, a sound I had never heard from her before, and then she bolted from the couch, disappearing into the bedroom. I was left sitting there, my heart pounding in my chest, trying to make sense of what had just happened. Luna had always been a bit skittish, but this was different. This was fear, real, palpable fear, and it unnerved me. Over the next few days, Luna's strange behavior continued. She would stare at empty spaces, her eyes wide, her body tense, as if she was seeing something that I couldn't. She would avoid certain areas of the apartment, skirting around them as if they were dangerous. And she started spending more and more time hiding under the bed, only coming out when she was absolutely sure that it was safe. I tried to comfort her, tried to coax her out with treats and toys, but nothing worked. The fear that had taken hold of her was something I couldn't understand, something that seemed to grow stronger with each passing day. And then there were the nights. Luna had always slept at the foot of my bed, a comforting presence that helped me feel less alone. But now, she refused to sleep in the bedroom. Instead, she would sit by the door, her ears perked, her eyes wide, as if she was standing guard. I would lie in bed, watching her, my mind racing with worry. What was she seeing? What was she hearing? I couldn't shake the feeling that there was something in the apartment, something that I couldn't see or hear, but that Luna could sense. The thought terrified me, but I tried to push it aside, telling myself that it was just my imagination. But as Luna's behavior grew more erratic, it became harder and harder to ignore the fear that had taken hold of both of us. I became obsessed with trying to figure out what was wrong with Luna. I spent hours researching online, reading about cat behavior, trying to find some explanation for what was happening. I even took her to the vet, hoping they could give me some answers, but they found nothing physically wrong with her. She was healthy, at least in body, but the fear that had taken hold of her was something that couldn't be explained by a simple checkup. I started paying more attention to the apartment, trying to see if there was something that could be causing Luna's distress. I checked for drafts, for strange smells, for anything out of the ordinary, but everything seemed normal. The apartment was quiet, still, and yet the sense of unease that had settled over it was impossible to ignore. I began to notice things, little things that I had previously brushed off as unimportant. The way the shadows seemed to move in the corners of the rooms, the way the air felt colder at certain times of the day, the way the lights would flicker ever so slightly, as if there was a power surge. And then there were the sounds, soft, almost imperceptible sounds that seemed to come from the walls, from the ceiling, from the very air around me. It was like a faint whisper, just on the edge of hearing, something that I couldn't quite make out, but that filled me with a sense of dread. I tried to ignore it, tried to tell myself that it was just my imagination, but it was impossible to shake the feeling that something was wrong, something that went beyond Luna's strange behavior. I started keeping a journal, documenting every little thing that happened, every change in Luna's behavior, every strange occurrence in the apartment. I wrote down the times when the lights flickered, when the air felt colder, when I heard those faint whispers. I wrote down the times when Luna would stare at the walls, when she would bolt from the room, when she would hide under the bed. The more I wrote, the more I began to see a pattern, a connection between Luna's behavior and the strange occurrences in the apartment. It was as if something was trying to make itself known, something that only Luna could sense. The fear that had taken hold of me was growing stronger with each passing day. I found myself dreading coming home, dreading the quiet, the stillness, the way the apartment seemed to close in around me. I started leaving the lights on at night, something I had never done before, but it didn't help. The darkness seemed to have a life of its own, something that the light couldn't touch. I was losing sleep, my mind racing with worry and fear. I couldn't focus at work, couldn't think about anything else but Luna and the strange, unexplainable things that were happening in my apartment. I felt like I was going crazy, like I was losing my grip on reality. And then, one day, Luna disappeared. It happened so suddenly, so inexplicably, that I was left reeling, unable to make sense of it. One minute, Luna was there, sitting by the door, her eyes fixed on something I couldn't see. The next, she was gone, vanished without a trace. I searched the apartment from top to bottom, calling her name, my voice trembling with panic. But there was no sign of her, no indication of where she had gone or how she had gotten out. The door was locked, the windows were closed, and yet Luna had simply disappeared. I was devastated, my mind racing with all the worst-case scenarios. Had she run away? Had someone taken her? Or had something happened to her, something that I couldn't explain? I spent hours searching the building, knocking on doors, asking the neighbors if they had seen her, but no one had. It was as if she had just vanished into thin air. I was heartbroken, lost in a fog of grief and confusion. Luna had been my constant companion, my source of comfort and love, and now she was gone, leaving behind nothing but an empty apartment and a heart that felt like it had been ripped in two. Days turned into weeks, and still there was no sign of her. I put up flyers, called shelters, did everything I could think of, but it was as if she had never existed, as if she had been erased from my life. And then, one night, she returned. It was late at night when I heard a sound coming from outside the front door. My heart skipped a beat as I jumped out of bed, barely able to believe it could be Luna. After weeks of searching, of endless worry and sleepless nights, could she really be back? I rushed to the door, my hands trembling as I fumbled with the lock. I pulled it open, and there she was, standing in the hallway, her sleek black fur glistening under the dim light. She looked up at me with those familiar green eyes, and for a moment my heart swelled with relief. She was back, safe and sound. But as I scooped her up in my arms, that relief was quickly replaced by a strange sense of unease. Luna felt different somehow. She was colder than I remembered, her body more rigid. And those eyes, there was something in them that wasn't quite right. A dullness, maybe, or a strange, unsettling emptiness that hadn't been there before. I brought her inside, closing the door behind us, and set her down in the living room. She wandered around aimlessly, her movements slow and disjointed, almost as if she was unsure of where she was. She didn't seem to recognize the apartment, or maybe she just didn't care. Either way, she wasn't acting like the Luna I knew. I tried to coax her with treats, with her favorite toy, but she showed no interest. She barely even looked at me, instead choosing to sit in the middle of the room, staring off into the distance. I watched her, my unease growing by the second. This wasn't the Luna who had been my constant companion for years. This was something else entirely. That night I barely slept. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, my mind racing with 1,000 questions. What had happened to her? Where had she been all this time? And most importantly, what had changed her? But Luna didn't provide any answers. She just sat there, unmoving, unresponsive, a silent, eerie presence in the apartment that had once felt like home. The next few days were a blur of confusion and growing dread. Luna's behavior became more and more erratic. She would sit for hours on end, staring at the walls or the corners of the room, her body tense, her eyes wide. Sometimes she would let out a low, guttural growl, a sound that sent chills down my spine. Other times she would vanish for hours, hiding in places I couldn't find, only to reappear suddenly, as if she had never left. I tried to convince myself that she was just adjusting after her time away, that she would eventually return to her old self. But deep down I knew that something was horribly, inexplicably wrong. One night, after another day of strange behavior, Luna did something that I couldn't ignore. It was around midnight, and I was sitting on the couch, trying to lose myself in a book, to forget the growing tension that filled the apartment. Luna was in her usual spot, staring at the far wall, her eyes unblinking. Suddenly she stood up and began walking toward the front door. At first I didn't think much of it. Maybe she just wanted to be let out. But then she stopped right in front of the door and started scratching at it with an intensity I hadn't seen before. It was as if she was desperate to get out, her claws scraping against the wood with a frantic energy. I got up and went over to her, intending to let her out, but as I reached for the doorknob, I felt a sudden, overwhelming sense of dread. It was like a cold hand gripping my heart, a voice in the back of my mind screaming at me to stop. I froze, my hand inches from the knob, my breath catching in my throat. Luna's scratching grew more frantic, more desperate, and then she turned to look at me. Her eyes were wild, filled with a fear that I had never seen in her before. It was as if she was trying to tell me something, trying to warn me. And then I heard it, a soft, almost imperceptible sound coming from the other side of the door. It was a faint scratching, like the sound of nails scraping against wood, mirroring Luna's frantic efforts. My heart pounded in my chest as I stood there, frozen in place. The scratching grew louder, more insistent, and then, to my horror, I realized that it wasn't coming from outside the door. It was coming from inside the walls. The realization hit me like a punch to the gut, and I stumbled back, away from the door, my mind reeling with terror. What was happening? What was inside my apartment? Luna let out a yowl, a sound of pure terror, and bolted from the door, disappearing into the shadows. I was left standing there alone, with the scratching growing louder and louder, filling the apartment with an unbearable noise. I knew I had to leave. Whatever was in the walls, whatever was causing that terrible sound, it wasn't something I could face. I grabbed my keys, my phone, and bolted for the door, my heart racing with fear. But as I reached for the doorknob, the scratching stopped. The apartment fell into an eerie silence, the kind of silence that makes your skin crawl, that fills you with a deep, primal fear. And then, slowly, the doorknob began to turn. I stood there, paralyzed with terror, as the doorknob twisted and the door slowly creaked open. The hallway outside was pitch black, the darkness spilling into the apartment like a living thing. I took a step back, my mind screaming at me to run, to get as far away as possible, but I couldn't move. I was rooted to the spot, my eyes fixed on the darkness that seemed to pulse and writhe just beyond the door. And then I saw them, eyes glowing in the dark, staring at me with a malevolent hunger that made my blood run cold. They were small, round, blocking the doorway. I ran through the door and out of the building, not sure what I had seen or what was going on. To this day, I don't know what happened that night, what those eyes in the darkness were, or where Luna had gone before she returned. All I know is that whatever it wasn't something I could understand, something I could fight.